Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Sainato, and tonight we have a very special guest with us. This is Dr. Gail Dines with us. She's the author of Pornland, and she's the founder and president of the organization Cultural Reframed. On our promo, I linked the Amazon to her book, and I also linked a short speech she gave at the U.S. Capitol this past April. So Dr. Dines, thank you for agreeing to do this interview this evening.
It's a pleasure, and please call me Gail.
All right, thank you, Gail. So Gail, could you start off by telling us just a little bit about your background and your work, and just could you answer the broad question in general, why should someone be against porn? And how does the feminist opposition to porn differ from the anti-porn movement pushed by the Christian right and the Christian fundamentalists that it's often associated and dismissed with? And those movements tend to oppress women in different ways.
Okay, well, first let me make it clear. You're talking to a left-wing radical feminist Jew, okay? So let's get that out of the way to begin with. So my history of being anti-pornography came out of the feminist movement that basically defined pornography as a form of violence against women in both its construction and its production and its distribution. Any feminist who is concerned about violence against women, indeed anybody, should see that pornography is one of the main causes of this increased level of male violence against women today. Now, of course, it's not the only cause. You can't say in social science or in the real world A causes B. But there is something going on that is profound in terms of the increased level of violence against women, the increased level of sexual harassment, sexting, revenge porn. And so what's happening is pornography, since it became free through the free internet sites, which, by the way, was developed by one company called MindGeek, which is housed in Luxembourg. What people don't often know, and seeing we're on a progressive platform here, is to talk about the fact that when we're looking at pornography, we're looking at one of the most concentrated predatory corporations in the world. The vast majority of pornography today is distributed via one company, MindGeek, in Luxembourg, with offices all over the world. So let's talk about it from, first of all, an issue around economics and profits. What pornography does, first and foremost, is it monetizes women's bodies. And the problem with that is that we got, hopefully, agree in this country that slavery is not okay. And when you sell women, as in pornography, as in prostitution, what you're doing is you're monetizing women's bodies, and basically women are being sort of paid, it's paid rape. That's what pornography and prostitution is. And I am putting the two together because we need to think of pornography as prostitution with the camera going. So I would argue that the main issue here is if we care about women, we care about violence against women, and also if we care about boys and their well-being, then it is absolutely crucial that we look at pornography, understand it, look at the science around what its impact is, and then organize to stop this industry.
And Gail, can you tell us a little bit about how porn impacts the viewer and their relationship with women? There was a study a few years ago that German scientists found that porn reduces gray matter in the brain. Even last year, recently, a lot of U.S. Navy doctors did a broad study that found 1,000% increase in erectile dysfunction in young sailors who had obsessions and addictions to pornography, and a lot of different studies have corroborated those findings and found that teenagers growing up with depending on porn as sexual education were growing up with either erectile dysfunction or they want a sexual dysfunction. So can you tell us a little bit about those aspects of it?
Well, you basically covered it really well. I mean, you looked at the social, you looked at the emotional, the cognitive, and the behavioral impacts of porn. What we know from over 40 years of research is that the earlier men and boys access porn, the more likely they are to be sexually callous, to be sexual victimizers, the more likely they are to have less empathy for rape victims, the more likely they are to have less capacity for intimacy. And now what we're finding from the research is, of course, that massive increase in erectile dysfunction. And it's specifically between the ages of 15 to 25 that that increase has happened. We also know it's a major driver of demand towards trafficked and prostituted women. We know that the impact on the brain now with the new research where they have the capacity to actually watch what happens to men and boys who are looking at porn is that they found from studies that porn is more addictive than cocaine, than heroin, and is on the same level as methamphetamine. So you've got all of this research coming together in a perfect storm from the social psychologists, the experimental psychologists, the sociologists, the neuroscientists, and indeed also public health experts to show that porn is, number one, the major form of sex education. Number two, mainstream porn is violent. Virtually all of mainstream porn is violent. If you want to look for softcore porn, you'll find it, but it might take you 10 to 15 minutes. Whereas if you want hardcore porn, it will take you 15 seconds. So you tell me what 13-year-old boy with an erection is going to start spending 15 minutes looking for softcore porn when hardcore porn is immediately what he gets catapulted into when he puts porn into Google. So all of this impact is to begin to ask, what does it mean? Is our culture sustainable by virtue of bringing up a generation of boys on hardcore porn? Because these boys are going to then come on. We know in a patriarchal society that boys and men, especially men as they grow up, they still run the country. They are the doctors, the lawyers, the capitalists on Wall Street, you name it, they have control. What kind of men are they going to be when they have less capacity for intimacy, connection, relationships, all of those things? I mean, we're in a bad enough state as it is in the world when you think about all the social problems we have around poverty, climate change, violence. How much worse is this going to get when in reality these boys are going to become men? And then, of course, I've just seen there was a question about good porn, bad porn. It's so amazing. Everyone wants me to talk about good porn. It's as if you had me on a show right now and you want me to talk about, I don't know, genetically modified tomatoes, right? And talking about the impact of genetically modified food. And somebody would suddenly write to me, excuse me, I sell homegrown tomatoes at the bottom of my stand at the bottom of my house, so why are you worried about Walmart? I mean, you can see how ridiculous it is. There might be a little bit of not so much good porn, but porn that's not so violent. But don't ask a progressive person who studies capitalism and its impact to talk about small sort of co-ops or worker-owned organizations when what we're facing is a tsunami of corporate controlled society and a tsunami of pornography controlled by a predatory industry, specifically by one company called MindGeek. So I want progressives to start thinking about pornography as they would about any other industry and not ask me these trivial questions about what is good porn. You wouldn't ask me about, if we were talking about a major Walmart, to talk about small worker-owned co-ops. It doesn't change the fact that Walmart is still destroying our environment, is still exploiting its workers. None of that changes that. So I would like progressives to please put their brains back in their head when it comes to porn and start thinking in a progressive way about what does it mean that the porn industry is the major form of sex ed today.
And I think one way for people to be able to look at that is, and you've brought up in some of your videos how racist stereotypes are perpetuated, by porn, and they get overlooked at that, and be free from outrage that the porn industry is able to do this, with widespread distribution, and no one's like, oh, this is racist. So can you speak a little bit to those issues?
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting is that we hope as a country we have the government notwithstanding, some level of, sort of sensitivity to the fact that you can't be overtly racist. I mean, we know the horrors that are going on with young black men being shot, the economic racism, environmental racism, but we do understand. And I'll give you a good example. One of the best-selling porn series is called "Oh No, There's a Negro in My Sister." "Oh No, There's a Negro in My Mother." "Oh No, There's a Negro in My whatever girlfriend." Could you imagine a sitcom, "Oh No, There's a Negro in My Suburb"? I mean, it would be unthinkable. No station would carry it. There would be, quite rightly so, massive protests against that level of racism. Yet in pornography, nobody seems to talk about the fact that black men are shown as hypersexualized rapists of white women, that black women are shown as mouthy, very much like the Moynihan Report, women who've got too much power who need to be smacked back into submission. That also what pornography does is it cements racist stereotypes in whites via orgasm. So I'll give you an example. One of the best-selling genres in pornography is called interracial porn, which actually is a white woman with black men. Now, it's mainly for a white audience. So you've got three white men pounding away at a white woman. And then the question becomes, why do white men in the United States want to see a white woman being, pounded away orally, anally, vaginally by black men? And then it suddenly dawned on me as I'm watching this, because I realized that, again, the audience is very clear it's for white men, is in this society, black bodies have been demonized as the carrier of all that is deviant, which of course is also leading to all the violence against young black men. So if pornography is about the dehumanization and debasement of women, what better way to debase a white woman in the eyes of white men than to have her penetrated over and over again by a carrier of all that is deviant, i.e. black male skin. So the fact of the racism that is so profound in pornography, not to mention the idea that Asian women were put on this earth just to please white men, none of these things would be acceptable in any other genre. But suddenly in pornography, it's okay to have incredible racist ideologies and stereotypes that, by the way, have a profound effect on how white people think about race and their own construction of whiteness.
And what is the media's role in all this? How is porn culture reflected in media and popular culture? How does media enable these reflections? How does the media perpetuate the objectification of women and the profitization of this imagery?
Well, first of all, what you find today is that most of softcore porn has migrated into pop culture. So you look at Victoria's Secret's ads, you look at Cosmopolitan, you watch MTV, and the kind of imagery and objectification of women's bodies that you see there 10, 15, 20 years ago were basically considered to be only in pornography magazines. What the mainstream pop culture does, because it's so hypersexualized, both for women and men, but especially for women, it's kind of a grooming technique. It grooms our culture to think of women as nothing more than sex objects to be fucked and then move on. You take that, you times it by thousands, and you get to hardcore porn. But that notion that women's bodies should be monetized, that women's bodies are commodified, that women's bodies exist for male use is actually at the very center of pornography. So I think it's very important that pop culture grooms and seduces and seasons our culture into accepting the fact that women are put on this earth basically to be monetized, used and abused by men sexually, and then you just move over along to pornography, which is even more hardcore. And remember, the more hardcore that porn becomes, the more softcore pop culture becomes hardcore, and the more that pop culture becomes hardcore, the more you have to take pornography to be hardcore as a way to distinguish its products from mainstream pop culture. So they work as a kind of in a synergistic way. So the more you hypersexualize and commodify women in pop culture, the worse porn is going to be.
And can you speak on how you counter some of the arguments you often encounter, with your work? One of the common arguments I saw in my research is people try to claim that the existence and widespread prevalence of porn on the internet reduces sexual assaults, rapes, and abuse because it provides abusers with an outlet to feed their inhibitions.
I would say that's probably as scientifically valid as Ronald Reagan saying that trees create pollution, right? It takes no account of the research. It's ridiculous. There is no studies that support that. All the studies support the absolute opposite, that pornography causes male violence against women. Now you have both correlation and causation. It both correlates with and causes, because we now have longitudinal data, which is more towards causation than correlation. So, I mean, what I would argue is that anyone who says that obviously has never read the research, doesn't understand the research, or like a lot of, say, for example, climate change deniers, has picked up a junk study that is an outlier and is using this to make the argument. So I would say read the work, read the research, read meta-analysis. That's the best way to do a meta-analysis. Looks at anything from 5 to 50 studies, then come back and argue that with me.
And do you support the anti-pornography civil rights ordinance proposed in the 1980s by Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon? And could you explain to our viewers a little bit about that ordinance and similar solutions that have been pushed for since then?
Yeah, well, the ordinance, basically, the brilliance of that was to define pornography and its production and consumption, and now we have to, of course, add distribution, given the internet, as a violation of women's civil rights. And I think a lot of the arguments that Dworkin and McKinnon put forward in that ordinance stand. The problem is that they wrote that ordinance when most of porn was distributed through brick and mortar shops. So now if we're going to think about what to do about pornography, we're going to have to get real here and realize that we live in the internet age and that the feeding chain of people involved in pornography is so much wider, so much more complex. And we're going to have to rethink what we do about pornography. Now, other countries, so when I was in Iceland a few years ago, one of the things they were thinking of doing in Iceland was basically shutting down all of violent pornography, because in Iceland it's written in the constitution that women are equal to men, and the argument is that pornography violates the women's civil rights. Pornography violates women's civil rights. You cannot therefore have a constitution that says women and men are equal and have men have access to hardcore porn that degrades and dehumanizes women. So in terms of the constitution, what they were arguing is that Icelandic men should not have access to hardcore violent porn. Now, of course, what people are going to argue is, what is hardcore violent? Your definition of violent is different. Actually, we have got very clear definitions of what violence are. When you're choking somebody with a penis till they can't breathe and they almost vomit, we know that's violent. When you're slapping, punching, pounding away anally at a woman till her anus is red raw and bleeding, we know that's violence. We know that's a form of torture. So what they were going to do in Iceland was actually list what were the acts that constituted violence. So it wouldn't be this broad view. It would be very clear. Anything that goes against the UN Treaty on Torture, because the interesting thing about sort of talking about the UN Treaty on Torture is that you cannot consent to torture. Even if I say, go ahead and torture me, again, we have decided that a civil society should not have torture. So you cannot consent. So when people argue, women in the pornography industry consented, my argument is you cannot consent to torture. We should not, as a society, allow that consent. I'm not allowed to sell my kidney. Why am I not allowed to sell my kidney? Because we know exactly what will happen if we allow people to sell kidneys. Poor people will be selling their kidneys to rich people. We know how the system works. So we have to have a collective agreement of what does a civil, sustainable society look like. And that was what they were doing in Iceland when the left Greens were in power. Sadly, the left Greens got voted out and that got put on the back burner. In England now, they're doing age verification, where what they're doing is verifying the age through a third party of the person going on the pornography site. And if that pornography site is in violation of checking up on that third-party age verification, that porn site, not only does it get fined, it gets dropped at the internet's provider level. So you'll never find them again. And all the accompanying accoutrements of Visa, MasterCard and everything, they can't also be used to buy that pornography. So having said that, I just want to be very clear the role that, pornography is now a mainstream above ground industry. That means it has its tentacles in every bit of global capitalism you can think of. Credit card companies, venture capitalists, global banks, everywhere. This is what has really had the impact of making pornography mainstream, is it is now woven into mainstream global capitalism. And that's one of the big problems.
And last year you had an op-ed in the Washington Post, and they published somewhat of a retort to that by Morel Miller-Young, and she claims in it that the porn industry isn't a public health crisis, but rather a scapegoat. So I was interested in what your response is to what she wrote in that op-ed.
I think the word you say claims is true, because that's all she does. She claims. There's no research. There's no analysis of the 40 years of research. She just basically said it's not public health. I mean, anyone can say that. If she's going to argue against, it was originally because I wrote the op-ed, and then people were asked to respond a few weeks later. And in my op-ed, I quote all the studies, I discuss the studies. I mean, that's what you do. She's an academic, Miller-Young. She should be quoting studies. She should be looking at the research. I mean, just to claim that it's not a public health issue is hardly scholarly work that should be seen to be taken seriously.
And in terms of the research, are there obstacles in researching the porn industry? What resources would you direct people toward finding those? And in terms of any voids, if they exist within those research, what can be done within the sociology community, the science community, to compensate for those voids where more research needs to be done to really figure out what exactly the effects of this industry is having on our culture and on our society?
Okay, well, this might be strange coming from somebody who's an academic, but there's a point at which you've got to stop the research and start being an activist, okay? I mean, for example, I was just listening to an interesting show about global warming and how close we are to absolute devastation. I mean, really, do we need more research on climate change, or should we not be out there organizing in the streets? That's how I feel about pornography. We have 40 years of research. I read the research, it's very useful to me, but we need to be out there organizing in the streets against this predatory industry. One of the things that we've done at Culture Reframed, and I suggest if anyone's interested in our work, they should go on culturereframed.org, is that we are actually a public health organization building educational programs for parents and health professionals in how to build resilience and resistance in kids to the porn culture, specifically how to build resilience and resistance in boys to pornography and for girls into the hypersexualized pop culture. So at the moment in the United States, when you think what is the best way to tackle this industry, I think the best way to do it is to what I call the Gulliver strategy. That's kind of, what a lot of progressives use. You come at it from lots of different angles. My organization comes at it through education. How do parents talk to kids about pornography? No one even knows that. I mean, I will go and lecture. It can be to social workers, it can be pediatricians, parents groups. It doesn't matter. They're all at a complete loss how to have conversations with their kids around pornography. So we will have an online program with best practices for how to talk to kids. We're also building programs for therapists, for pediatricians, because the other interesting thing is that even the health professionals don't know that this is actually a public health crisis. It's kind of a stealth public health crisis. So we're coming at this through education. The other side of me, which is also, a radical activist, is we should be out there in the streets protesting, absolutely protesting. And what I would argue is that, the progressive movement has to take on sexism, it has to take on pornography, it has to take on racism, all of these issues. Otherwise, the progressive movement is not worth its name.
And what advice would young men about not using porn, and in turn, what advice would you give to young women on ways they can push back against porn and the widespread use of it?
Well, I would say to young men that I would suggest you become the owner and the author of your own sexuality. Don't allow the pornographers to hijack it from you. Let's talk about what they do. They commodify sexuality, they steal it from you, and then they hand it back to you at a price for something that looks nothing like it really was. So to young men, I would say stop using porn. The pornographers are out to bankrupt you on every level, morally, socially, erectile dysfunction, and economically. I would say also, if you have any women in your life that you care about, you have an absolute political duty to stop using pornography. And I would say to women, and this is what's difficult for women who are heterosexual and out looking to partner, is you cannot be with a man who uses porn. You simply cannot. Now, you're not going to find a man today, very unlikely, who's not using porn somewhat on a regular basis. Okay, that's understandable. But then he has to start reading about it. There's plenty of stuff written about it. I suggest they go to Robert Jensen's website. He writes a lot about pornography and feminism. I would also suggest that they read books by Jackson Katz, that they look at TED Talks about men, specifically Jackson Katz did a TED Talk on why violence against women is a male problem. And I would say men educate themselves. It's not up to women to educate men about violence against women, just as it's not up to white people, it's not up to black people to educate whites about racism. It's on us to do that. It's on men to educate themselves, and specifically women have to put their foot down. We have a very low bar when it comes to what we want from men, a very low bar. We need to start raising the bar on what a decent man looks like. And first and foremost, what a decent man looks like is not enough to say, I don't rape women. You cannot leave it to a bunch of impoverished feminists to fight violence against women. You have to join us. You have to stand beside us and sometimes behind us, never in front of us in this battle. And you have to work to stop violence against women. It is not enough to leave it to us. We are overwhelmed with all the mess that men make on every level. And to be quite honest, we're sick of cleaning it up. We're sick of doing men's laundry. We're sick of cooking their meals, and we're sick of cleaning up the mess they leave in society.
And is there anything else you would like our viewers to know about the porn industry, or is there anything upcoming that you're involved with that you would like to plug?
Well, there's a lot of talks I'm giving, mainly actually internationally, less so in the United States. In October, interestingly enough, I'm going to Rome, where there's going to be a conference with the Pope present and world leaders to talk about how to stop digital abuse of the child, including pornography in that. We'll see if something major comes out of that. I also would suggest that if they want more information, feel free to go on the Culture Reframed website, email us. We will send you more information. We've got studies up there as well. If people want to read the empirical evidence, if there's issues I've not covered, then people can help us. And of course, what we always need as a nonprofit is fundraising. So if anybody out there is listening and would like to help us, one of the things we need mainly is please donate to our organization, because unfortunately in the United States of America, most of the money has been privatized and it leaves the nonprofits scrambling for the little bit of money that's left in the public coffers. So we need help there also. We are the only feminist anti-porn group in the country. It is ridiculous that we are the only feminist anti-porn group. We need help. We need people to work with us.
All right, well, again for coming on this evening. And I will, for everyone watching, I put a couple links on the promo, but I will add more and add Culture Reframe's website on the video comments as well after we end.
And I also suggest to add my TEDx talk, because that kind of my TEDx talk puts all of my life's work into 13 minutes. So that's a good way to get acquainted.
I will do that. And thank you very much again, Gail. It was a pleasure, and I think I learned, and I hope our viewers learned a lot from it.
Thank you very much for interviewing me. It was a pleasure talking to you. Have a good evening. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.